What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Well, John, are you ready for some football? We're going to be talking about America's game, or at least some think it is. Some are having some doubts about it. Well, welcome back, by the way, to America Trends podcast. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsick. And, John, nothing goes without our scrutiny. We look at all kinds of things. And we decided to look at football. Do you watch a lot of football, John?
Actually, I watch a little football. Not a lot.
I mean, what's your favorite sport? I don't think I've ever asked you that.
I like baseball.
Baseball.
I like the speed of baseball. I mean, people don't like that, but I don't know. I like baseball. Though I like baseball that, I think pitchers should be hitting. Even though I'm a Red Sox fan, I enjoy when they do strategies. They bunt. They
so
steal.
You like the National League?
Well, more, but they're getting away from that too. Even because it slows down the game.
Well, there's a lot of things that slow down the game of baseball. I mean, I have really grown to reappreciate baseball over the last couple of years. Not only because my team, the San Francisco Giants, have done very well in this recent period, but there's something about the connection to your boyhood. And I think when you and I were growing up, baseball was king of the hill.
Was big.
No
yes.
question. And there's something about the beauty of these parks. And I went out to AT&T and, of course, Yankee Stadium, Citi Field, and Fenway.
You had my
among
terrible
them.
seats at Fenway.
Yeah, we did.
But we won't talk about that.
Oh, my goodness. But baseball has a beauty and a finesse about it that comes back to you, I think. And there's something very nostalgic in watching a baseball game from time to time and thinking about your boyhood and the slower pace at that time. And today we've speeded it up. We've put a clock on it. And that's why football and basketball have really begun to dominate a lot of the conversation in America.
Hey, you're right. I mean, basketball drives me crazy because something will happen and then boom, you're on. What the heck happened? I mean, basketball is just nuts.
Yeah, but I got to tell you, honestly, John, as much as I say I've kind of rediscovered baseball, my favorite sport in the recent period clearly has been basketball. Not only because of the UConn women's team, their success and an association with that program for years, but UConn athletics altogether.
I enjoy it with the women because they actually play as a team. They actually feed each other, whereas professional basketball is really dominated by two or three guys on the court usually.
But I got to tell you, as a long-suffering Knicks fan, DeBusschere, over to Reed, back to Frazier. And I think about that, my entire life has been built around the Knicks. And I hate to say that, but I will suspend various activities so I can watch my Knicks. So I'm really into, and I know they're horrible folks, but I love them anyway. I love the Garden. I love going down there. So basketball has begun to predominate in my life. But there was a period, and believe it or not, I'm all over the place. I'm a New York Knicks fan. I'm a San Francisco Giants fan, but I'm also a Washington Redskins fan when I watched football. But I've really turned off to football over the recent years, and part of it is that we've done reporting on the radio program several years back about these head injuries and concussions. And I must say that I think it's reached a point now where America has got to have a good talking to with itself about football.
Absolutely. Well, when Frontline came out with that piece,
that was so powerful.
That just really, I don't know how any parent can let their child play football, to be quite honest with you, because that was just an eye-opener. And then all the new information that keeps coming out, it's scary.
Well, I saw the movie with Will Smith, which dramatized a lot of what it was that Frontline was talking about with that professor from Pittsburgh,
Right.
and nobody wanted to hear him. Nobody wanted to listen, and what he did with the brain of a former Pittsburgh Steeler. And everybody said, oh, let's pretend that is an isolated incident. And then we realized that it is not isolated in any way. And today, of course, we are talking to you right after the information came out that Aaron Hernandez, at a very young age, had CTE, which is that brain disease as a result of continuing pounding and concussion. And so we don't know, and look, that's not to make any excuse for what he did, but there are so many behaviors that take place in many of these players going on in their lives that really worry their families and worry society, and they should.
Absolutely. I'm just a little surprised that some of the guys that are playing now are, some of the older quarterbacks and stuff like Brady and stuff haven't said, well, I've made my dough, and they can go and be a sportscaster and stuff. I don't know why they're continuing. I honestly don't.
Well, in the next segment here on America Trends Podcast, we are going to be talking to a man by the name of Steve Almond, and he's written a book called Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. And I think reluctant is really the term to fasten onto, because Steve loved football, like many people love football. And then he began to think about what he was contributing to by watching it, just as a fan, what he was supporting. And it's really interesting, John, aside from this information about Aaron Hernandez, we see where ratings on television for football are going down precipitously. You think it's related to this?
I think that's part of it. I think, you got the people who are also tired of paying the high cable bills and are either skimping back. But I think this is part of it. I think that's part of it, because, it's unbelievable, what's going on with these guys when they get older.
Well, some of the folks are very concerned about the behavior of a lot of NFL players and the way the league has treated it or not treated it. I think some people are just tired of the brutality. Maybe there were many women becoming big fans of football. Maybe they're beginning to ebb away from the game. We don't know exactly why. But I've got to tell you, when we spoke, and we're recording this after we had a conversation with Steve Almond, I thought he gave us such a nuanced look at what it is about football. Very smart guy. And you really are going to look at this now, I think, after listening to this in a new context. And, of course, there are so many reasons why it's going to be a long time before anybody sees football leaving the stage altogether, though some people are speculating that it could happen in our lifetimes, John.
Oh, I believe that. I think those big contracts, those big TV contracts, I think they're going to have to start reconsidering those. You see what's going on at ESPN and stuff, and their problems. So I think those big TV contracts are going to be coming to an end when they come up again.
Well, I noticed that last night's game, I was reading something online that said there was a half-filled stadium between the Rams and the 49ers, and that was stunning. I guess they had to show it on television. They still say that it was a sellout, but people just didn't attend.
Yeah, wow.
So maybe this is the beginning of a change in the way that America looks at football as its newly adopted favorite pastime. And we're going to be talking again to Steve Almond about this. But think about all the interests, John, that have to be in some way pushed away. You think about all the advertisers. You think about the television networks. You think about all the colleges and their programs and what it means to the university. I mean, this is an important subject, and that's why we're treating it very seriously here on America Trends, because this has many ramifications.
It's a good thing UConn didn't get their program off the ground.
Well, they're still trying. But what we're really fastened onto, again, is the health and well-being of those who participate. And, John, one of the ways that you kill a game is by taking a lot of the natural talent off the field. And if you don't mature and make that talent, part of the lexicon and don't allow young people to play, you begin to really, squeeze the game at a very critical time.
Right. Well, yeah, all these peewee once that starts drying up, then they're going to have problems.
And there's this article in the Wall Street Journal, building and selling a better helmet. Now, everybody's been talking about that's the answer. We're going to have a better helmet. And one of the problems, I think, is, well, first, they're saying that even amid heightened focus on concussions and head trauma, many NFL players are reluctant to change their equipment. And if they did have a safer helmet, whatever that is,
right,
still, then they say, well, now I can hit harder and I can use my head more because the helmet is going to protect me. I don't know that there's any equipment or technology that's going to help us through this.
I think we found out that our brains are a little more fragile than we originally thought, that any type of trauma is bad trauma for your brain.
And it's like having a number of mild accidents in the course of one day with your head hitting the windshield. When you think about what these offensive and defensive linemen are doing and the size of these guys, it's really remarkable. Well, we talk about all of that in the context of our conversation with Steve Almond. So let's get to that right now.
Let's get him on.
All right. Well, with us on the line is Steve Almond, and he wrote the book, reluctantly, Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. Steve, how difficult was it as a fan of over 40 years to write the book?
Well, writing the book was not as hard as stopping watching football. That's much more difficult. And I wrote the book not because I hate football, just the opposite, because I really love it. I think it's the most astonishing, remarkable, graceful, gratifyingly violent, just narratively interesting and strategically dense sport in America. That's why it's the most popular sport, I think, and the most profitable sport. And I have been was a fan from 5 years old on, and played a little bit, not seriously, but a little bit, enough to recognize what's so remarkable about it, which is that you're really at risk when you play football. There's a kind of visceral thrill to it because people are putting their bodies on the line, and so the tough thing for me was morally interrogating it. As Americans, I think this is true of human beings, but especially of Americans, we love our bacon, but we don't want to visit the slaughterhouse. And for me, writing the book was kind of visiting the slaughterhouse and realizing, wow, if I really morally interrogate what football is about on a whole bunch of different levels, it doesn't line up with what I say my values are when I'm not watching. And so it's really very much a reluctant manifesto, written as it's more like a lamentation.
And when did you come to this?
It's like they say. They ask people during the Great Depression, how'd you lose your fortune, and the answer would be a little bit at a time, and then all of a sudden. That's really what it was like for me. My realization that the sport was out of sync with I guess what I take to be my values, I could trace to dozens of different moments. If it's like sitting down next to my 4-year-old, 5-year-old daughter and having her watch the game and just say, "Hey, Papa, are there any girls who play this sport?" And then I have to point to the sidelines and say to this young, aspiring, powerful young woman, "Well, here's how women are expected to behave and how they're regarded in this world. They're on the sidelines bouncing half naked." I think for me, one of the central things that really pushed me into wanting to write about the sport in this way was having my mom experience a cognitive decline, and especially a sudden event where she fell and really her brain stopped working for several days. I'd never seen anything like that. I'd been lucky in that sense. I had never really come face to face with the reality of what it's like when somebody's has a neurological disease, when their brain isn't functioning. And I think people tend to say, "Oh, well, the brain is just your intellect, and it's really your soul or your heart that's kind of the core of a person." I can tell you, walking into the hospital room where my mom was, the ICU unit, when your brain is gone, you're gone. It's really who you are. And so for several days, she just did not know where she was, entirely who she was. She had trouble recognizing me. She was lost. And all of a sudden, all the stories that I'd been reading and the clips and so forth that I'd been seeing, making reference to how so many football players are struggling with cognitive decline and neurological illness, suddenly that wasn't so far away anymore. It was right in my own family. It was my mom. And, that gave me real pause to say, when we smoke, everybody's taking the risk. You pick up a cigarette and you inhale, you know that you're, in exchange for that pleasure, you might be getting cancer, right? But with football, the fans really don't run any risk. They watch other people incur risk, and again, within the context of an incredibly dramatic and exciting game, but we're basically safe. We're insulated from any harm, and our sponsor, our fandom is what sponsors the game. Without us, football isn't this huge billion-dollar industry. So it's painful and unpleasant to connect, but those are the synapses that I was trying to connect when I wrote the book.
Many years ago, I remember a documentary about Jim Otto, who was that famed center for the Oakland Raiders, and it was called Disposable Heroes. So we knew many years ago about the orthopedic effects of football, the degraded hips, shoulders, ankles,
right,
fingers, whatever. But that didn't really faze us, did it?
I don't think so, and I can kind of understand that. As brutal as that sounds, the idea that there are people who choose a short, glorious life or more glorious life to a long, dull one, that's as old as Achilles, right? That's as old as the Greeks. I think what's happened recently, and the analogy with big tobacco and the tobacco industry is in some ways apt. What we've realized now over the past decade especially, but dating back a couple of decades, is that the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of small subconcussive events that football players receive every single season actually have the effect cumulatively of causing neurological damage. And it's not in a small portion of the players. According to the NFL themselves, they were sued basically by thousands of players and former players in this class action suit, and their own actuaries filed papers essentially saying, we estimate that, around 30% or up to 30% of our players are going to have some form of cognitive illness as they age. If you think about it, Larry, there's no other workplace in America where we would find that acceptable, not even in the military, right? Those guys are protecting the homeland. Would we say, 3 out of 10 are going to wind up with some kind of brain damage? That's okay. That's worth the risk. So that's the real question. I understand that when people, especially as I age, having knees that are banged up or hips, having difficulty walking, all of those things are really the price that the body pays. But when you're talking about brain damage, that fundamentally changes who you are. And I think in a sense it degrades your humanity in a way that other kinds of injuries don't. So I do think there's a difference. And I know that oftentimes people say a couple of things, and I said this for years. We all have kind of our suitcase of rationalizations. The first one is, well, these guys get paid a lot of money. They get paid a lot of money. They know what they're getting into. They're adults. Well, that's certainly true if they are adults, but the book isn't really interested in the choice that the players make. I understand absolutely why there are always going to be young men, whether it's in the military or football or some other high-contact sport, who want that risk, who want the glory that might come with that risk and the thrill of it. The question is really for fans to morally interrogate, well, why are you treating a sport that results in brain damage as a form of entertainment? What's going on in your psyche and in your conscience that allows you to do that? The other thing that I think folks say that I think, again, I said for years and years is, look, I'm just a fan. It doesn't mean anything. I just watch it. I'm not somehow a bad player here. And again, I think in America it's very hard to face this, but when you consume something, in capitalism really, you're voting with your attention and you're voting with your money. So for me, I know that if I'm clicking on a clip online, let's say I feel the Jones and my Oakland Raiders are getting better and I just decide to go to ESPN and see how they did last week, I'm actually contributing to the larger football industrial complex. I can tell myself I'm not, but that's really how it works.
It's interesting that you mentioned smoking. George Will wrote a column this week, Football's Enjoyment is on a Fade Pattern. And he was talking about how ironic it is that smoking is not allowed in stadiums anymore. And yet this activity that we know is so damaging neurologically is what it is that people are there to see. And then he also pointed out, but because today's risk-averse middle-class parents put crash helmets on their tykes riding tricycles, football participation will skew to the uninformed and economically desperate. Do you worry about that?
Well, look, every time we say, football is great because football is a ticket out for certain kids. It's a ticket to an education, to a high school, to keeping them in high school, to college scholarship, to advancement economically. We're really saying the same thing. When we say certain kids, that's coded language that means poor kids, and usually poor kids of color. And the arrangement that we've made in this culture, and again, I was a participant in this. I don't want to sound like, I'm sort of lecturing people from on high. I was and am a football fan, even if I'm not watching it at the moment. I have 40 years of sponsorship on my conscience. But the arrangement basically that we've always allowed ourselves to conduct, even if we don't acknowledge it, is that football and other sports, but football in particular, is a way out for certain kids. And that means we're essentially already saying, we're going to offload some of this risk and onto kids who need football more desperately because they don't have within their communities access to education and other kinds of support that allow them to have more opportunity in our culture. That's the bottom line. When you look at football, especially if you look at football, for instance, in the South, what you really are seeing is stadiums full of predominantly white people watching athletes who are predominantly African American, who are from communities that are predominantly African American and that are economically disadvantaged. We're already doing that. What I think will happen with this new research is that trend or that demographic reality will just become more and more exaggerated.
Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the disturbing medical study that showed that brain damage in the brains of 110 of 111 deceased NFL players. And to read what Ben Roethlisberger said, now he never struck me as being the most introspective guy. And he said, this JAMA study shows there's nothing to mess with. If you want to mess with your brain, you can't put a new one in. You can't have a brain transplant. If you want to mess with your brain, go ahead. I'm not going to. I love my family and friends. I want to play catch with my kids. I want to know my kids' names as much as I want my kids to remember what I did and watch me play the game. I also want to remember them when I'm 70. And yet he's still playing at, I think, 35. And then we learned that Tom Brady also has had many of these concussive events. Why are they staying around? But yet how important is this realization that some of these stars have come to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge deal. You'll remember a couple of years ago, Tony Dorsett essentially saying, I have trouble now remembering things. I can't remember where my kids play soccer. I can't and really sort of breaking down in tears, admitting I'm suffering from cognitive decline. What you had for many years, Larry, understandably, was a kind of omerta, a kind of code of silence, because these guys are used to being not just healthy, but super healthy. They're like, sort of the paragon of power, physical power and prowess in our culture. So for them to admit that they walk with a limp is a big deal, let alone that they're having difficulty not just finding their car keys, but finding their car. That's a big deal. And yet, these guys recognize, because their lives literally depend on it and the happiness of their families, that they are at risk. They read the stories about Junior Seau and Mike Webster and the other players who have either taken their lives or had severe depression and cognitive difficulty in the middle of their lives or at the end of their lives. They see all that. They are the ones who have skin in the game. And so I think there's this strange and more extreme form of cognitive dissonance where, on the one hand, they're saying, we've got to be aware of how dangerous this is, and we've got to be careful because we love our families and we want to live a long time and have a good quality of life. And another part of them is saying, hey, aren't you going to play this year? They've built their entire identity around being great football players and loving the game and feeling loyal to their teammates. It's an extremely complex moral situation to be in, and you can see where guys like Ben Roethlisberger or Tom Brady would say, hey, I'm aware of this, I'm aware of the risks, I'm aware of the dangers, I'm alarmed by them, and at the same time would feel the siren call to return to the game.
Well, we've got a lot of these young players now deciding at a very early stage of their career, no matter how heralded they've been and what potential they have, that they're going to stop after a couple of hits. Or there was a gentleman who is an MIT grad that I read about recently from the Baltimore Ravens, John Urschel, who said, no, I'm not putting myself at risk for all of this. So what is it that is going to get our attention? Is it going to be an early onset for a Ben or a Tom, or is it going to be this rush out the door early on, or is it going to be the fact that the game is going to go down because fewer kids are going to be playing at a young age because parents will not allow it?
Yeah, I mean, these are all good questions, but the answer is yes to everything. In other words, but we don't really know to what extent. Football is not going to disappear. It's too big an industry. People feel too deeply committed to it. They love it. They love watching it. It's a part of their lives, not just emotionally and psychologically, but I guess I want to say sort of spiritually. I mean, part of the question that the book is trying to ask is not just why is football morally questionable or troubling, but why do we love it? Why is it so important to us? I think that a culture is measured by and can be judged by the things it finds holy, the things it pays attention to, the things it worships. And I think football is at the top of that list. If we're honest with ourselves, I think the Americans in the aggregate think more about, care more about, or more passionate about football than just about anything else, including our religious identities. So it's profound, and what it plugs into is profound, and you're not going to erase that by scolding people or telling people, hey, this really does have all these adverse effects. I think what's going to happen, though, is as more and more people are aware of the underside of football, casual fans who are like me, maybe more ambivalent, reluctant, will turn away from the game. I think women who the NFL and college football has courted very aggressively might start to turn away from the game in greater numbers. But I don't think you're going to see any kind of precipitous decline in the game's importance. I think it's going to remain a huge big deal and huge big business. What I do think you will see is if somebody like Tom Brady or Steve Young or recently Brett Favre, recently retired players starts to show serious signs of cognitive decline and they talk about it openly, I think you will see that code of silence start to break down. And the other thing that's happening is that players have gotten bigger and stronger and faster over the past 40 years dramatically.
Absolutely.
The size and speed of athletes at this point was virtually unimaginable even 20 years ago. You have high school athletes who are bigger and faster than pros were 20 years ago. So, football doesn't have a concussion problem, and it doesn't even really have a violence problem. It's got a physics and physiology problem. You cannot, mass times acceleration equals force. Bigger, faster players are gonna really have bigger collisions in practice and games, and that the brain is always going to be a soft organ that's in this hard shell of the skull. There's no helmet that's going to make that go away. So I think what we're going to see is that potentially the rate of neurological damage might become noticeably higher simply because the players are bigger and stronger and faster.
I was shocked to read that only 21% of players weighed more than 200 pounds going back to the 1960s, and the heaviest weighed 223. Today, their size, it's almost like the way we're raising a lot of chickens and livestock with a lot of antibiotics and pumping them up. Can we start there by stopping some of the madness of trying to get these folks into this incredible form?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I do at the end of Against Football is say, look, I know that the sport is not going to disappear overnight, and I don't think it's appropriate for the government to come in and ban it or anything like that. That's really not the solution. If football is going to change and evolve, it's going to be because the fans demand it. So one of the things I note in the back are what are different things that we could do right now that would change the nature of the game and make it safer. And one of the central things is simply just putting a weight limit on teams so that rather than having an incentive system that says get bigger, take steroids, stuff yourself full of calories, the incentive would be to actually get smaller, to play at your natural weight. Right now, the incentives that are in place are really all about just winning in money and whatever will get you there. If that means turning yourself into 320 pounds who can run a 4.5 40, then that's what players are going to do. You have to change the incentives in order to change the behavior.
And what is the disincentive to doing that? Is it now that we've gotten so used to these 400-pound or 300-pound linemen? What is it that we would be reluctant to give up in that? Because there are so many ancillary businesses that feed off of what happens within the confines of that football field that we know they are very reluctant to change a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, basically you have to just look at it and say, well, what's the status quo and who's benefiting, who's profiting by it? Those are your interest groups. So there isn't a giant lobby saying, hey, let's have this weight limits. Let's create better padding. Let's do flag football or two-hand touch or make the penalties much more severe so that you start to really change behavior on the field. Those forces aren't as loud as the fans and the sort of people who are in and around the industry that are essentially saying, look, this is our national sport. This is a cult of hypermasculinity. I want to see the biggest, strongest, fastest human beings possible. I want to see them collide. I want to see, I want to see them fly around the field, as they say. I want to see them put somebody down who comes across the middle of the field. I think oftentimes we tell ourselves, and I certainly did this for many years and still do, I don't really like the big hits. I just want to see the graceful athletic stuff. Well, that's not really true if we're honest, because if we were truly disgusted by these big hits where you can see that a player's getting concussed or they're gruesomely injured, we would say, gee, it's fun to watch the game, but it's not worth watching that. Or maybe there's something wrong with me. Why am I getting off on something that's so brutal? So I think that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance within the fans as well as the players. And the behavior isn't going to change, really, I think, until the incentives change. And there's simply, as you point out, too many economic incentives in place right now to really appreciably change the game.
Jason Gay, in an article in the Wall Street Journal, said, in the meantime, current players trade in their own rationalizations. Those players in that CTE study were from a different era. The game is smarter now about handling head injuries. My equipment's better. I haven't had a bad concussion. You can get hurt doing anything. How much have we tried to rationalize why we watch this, why we love it, why we play it?
Well, I think the level of rationalization has gone up in correlation with the level of awareness of really how dangerous football is. And, that's the bottom line. If you're a fan, if somebody's listening to this who's a fan of football, or maybe they've turned it off by now, I don't know, but if they are listening still, if you're out there, I'm one of you, and the truth is if you're being told, hey, this game is really dangerous, and look at all these studies, and look at all these shriveled brains, and, listen to this family member describe what it was like when ... you really have to really kind of arm yourself morally and say, well, yeah, but, and you really, I think we rationalize more and more as we become more and more aware of the moral difficulties of the sport. The same thing is true. Just one of the chapters in the book is about the health risks. I also talk about the way in which football shapes our attitudes around gender, around violence, certainly around race. And that stuff in sexual orientation, that stuff is a lot more, it's harder to quantify, but it's equally powerful, or even the way that we look at the world economically. You have Houston, for instance, okay? They paid nearly $1 billion for a football franchise. Now, we all know what's going on in Houston right now. And I think there's some part of us that knows, $1 billion in taxpayer money would probably be better paid, would be better spent making sure that, flooding isn't as bad when the next huge storm comes, or that there are relief centers in place, or that there are communities that are made safer for if there is another huge meteorological event. We all know that as adults, but I think the siren call of football, the sense of identity it gives us, the connection we have to it, is so primal that we kind of put that part of our brains on hold. It's like a friend of mine who's a doctor of all things, his doctor at Harvard. He said, I have two parts to my brain. One part knows everything you're talking about, Steve, and the other part really loves football. And those two parts of my brain don't do a lot of talking.
Well, some say it's becoming a degrading enjoyment, and boxing being a parallel. When do we get to a point where football is not central in people's lives? Is it going to be something that you are going to see in your lifetime, do you suspect, Steve?
I don't know. It's really, the trajectory of things is so hard to predict. We don't know what medical research will offer us. For instance, one of the things that the medical researchers talk a lot about now is we are going to eventually get to a point where you can assess the risks and you can assess the condition of the brain in players who are still alive. As it is, you have to wait until a player has died and then do an autopsy on their brain. But they're developing medical technology that will allow us to assess if players currently are suffering from brain damage or neurological cognitive illness, whatever kind of euphemism you want to choose. If that were to happen, if those technologies were to develop more quickly than we expect, that would be a startling thing to realize, for instance, for a team to have data or for data to leak to the press, for instance, that essentially indicates, okay, here's what's going on with this particular player. They just suffered a grade 2 concussion, and here's actually some images of their brain, and also here's what's happening to their frontal lobes, and there's a significant chance that they are going to have long-term effects from this hit. That's not something that we've ever dealt with before. We just not, that would be terra incognita. So I think it's really impossible to predict, and so much of it really redounds to the extent to which fans start to connect, those two parts of their brain start talking. All I wanted to do in the book was not to tell people to stop watching football, but only just to start acknowledging everything that it is, the thrilling spectacle, the drama of it, the pleasure of it, but also the other things that we're consuming when we watch a game.
Steve Almond, I can't thank you enough for being a part of AmericaTrendsPodcast.com, where we deal with where we're going as a society and in our politics. And this is such an important issue. It really is, in many ways, perhaps beyond what it is most people think. Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. Pick up the book. There's many more insights in it. Steve Almond, thank you.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes, because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some rankings, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way, it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share our lists.
No spamming, nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our lists? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Nobody's
asked us.
But right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, @Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to
give
check
you
it
a
out
quiz.
now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. Hey, and you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back
Just
to
put
us.
what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste and you get more programming like this and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us out.
What's that?
Let
They're
us
not going to
out.
let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time. And we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.